Welcome to the latest edition of the Leader to Leader podcast. I'm your host, Susan Spears, President and CEO of the Fredericksburg Regional Chamber of Commerce. Our guest today is Dr. Troy Paino. He is the president of the University of Mary Washington here in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Troy, welcome.
Well, thank you, Susan, for having me.
Yes, thanks for being here. I'm going to share a little bit about your background with our listeners. I'm sure you'll get into some of this as we talk about your leadership journey, but let me tell them a little about you. So I enjoyed reading your bio today. 10th president of the University of Mary Washington, and you came in July 2016, and it's, as we're sitting here today, it's February 2022. That's flown by in a minute.
It has flown by.
Yeah, and the last 2 years were like 10 years.
I refer to them as dog years.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, you came to the University of Mary Washington after a 6-year stint as president of Truman State University in Kirksville, Missouri, and earned your doctorate and master's degrees in American Studies from Michigan State University.
Go Spartans.
Yeah, we got to go into the sports. I love it. He holds a law degree from Indiana University and a bachelor's degree in history and philosophy from, I'm going to say it wrong.
I'll say it, Evangel University.
Evangel. I don't know why that word should stump me. It looks very obvious.
Yeah.
I like this part of your bio. Teaching and scholarly interests include American higher education, 20th century cultural and social history, and American legal history. That's really quite interesting. And you've written extensively on the history of American sports and published a book, The Social History of the United States in the 1960s. I've never talked to you about some of that, and that's really quite interesting.
It's all in my past, yes.
Yeah, it's all the past. And here you are today. I remember seeing you, and I've said this to you before over the last 2 years, but I think that first week when we were shut down in March of 2020, you know that I live near the university, and you often see me and my dogs walking on campus there.
I love dogs, so I always like seeing you and your dog.
Yeah, but on this one particular day, it was the middle of the week, and it was the week when everything shut down, and it was a beautiful day. The sun was out. People were everywhere, and I remember passing you. You were, I believe, walking with your wife, and I was out with the dogs and my husband on opposite sides there on Kenmore Avenue. And I thought, and we waved and kept going, but it was surreal because that would never happen, under any other circumstance in the middle of the week during a busy business day or school day,
Yeah, I remember when all of it was coming to a screeching halt. We were actually in Florida, and it was our spring break, and we were starting to get word that this virus that we were learning something about was beginning to affect people's decisions and whether or not we should even bring the students back.
Right.
And I was trying to wrap my head around it. But I remember Kelly and I were looking at our calendar. Usually spring is the busiest time of year for a university president. And all of a sudden, everything, as you said, just shut down. And my calendar opened up. And all of a sudden, I was at home in the evening.
Right.
Surreal, yes.
And it probably was evening. My memory is wrong about that because I remember those days were crazy. But
it might have been during the day.
It could have been. Yeah, I don't know.
It's hard to know.
Yeah, and that 1 year stretched to 2, and so here we are. So I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be here together in person. I saw you in the last couple of weeks over at one of the Black History Month events that was on campus. Enjoyed seeing Dr. Catlett speak.
Great to hear her.
She was just on the podcast a week or so before you, so terrific to see you guys both back to back here. So I'll really kind of dive in for a second here. It's a leadership podcast, so tell me a little about that journey that leads you from your background to where you are today.
Yeah, well, if you go back to the beginning of my professional career, I was an attorney in Indianapolis, Indiana, and made the decision that I really wanted to do something that I loved and that I could see myself doing, and that is to work with young people at a critical point in their life. It was such a transformative experience for me, and a professor had a big influence on me that I decided to go back and get my PhD, and I thought that I was I was going to be a faculty member, and I would be in the classroom for 30, 40 years, and I would retire in that capacity. So I never really went back to get my PhD to think that I was going to go into leadership. And what really, I guess it's just my nature. And I think it's true probably of a lot of people who end up in leadership roles, is that you become a part of a community or a part of an organization, an institution, and you just instinctively start noticing things, whether they're problems or challenges or just ideas to make the place better, and you start throwing yourself into that, collaborating with others and coming up with different things that you can do to hopefully improve the quality of education, not just for your students, but for the entire campus. And so I started doing that as a young faculty member at my first faculty job, my only faculty job, I guess, now that I think about it. And as a young faculty member, the president of the university started taking notice that I was putting myself out there and coming up with ideas and organizing various things to enrich the campus. And the next thing you know, he starts telling people to appoint me to key committees, and thinks that I would be a positive influence in some of the conversations that were occurring around university, exposed me to a lot of things about running a university that I would have never known otherwise. And that ultimately, just very few years later, because of my involvement in a lot of things on campus, when the dean of the College of Liberal Arts was leaving for another position, actually, the outgoing dean came down to my office. I was in working on a Saturday and said, "You need to be the next dean. You need to apply for this job." And several other faculty members encouraged me to do so, even though I was a pretty young faculty member at the time, and I thought it was way too early for me to apply for such a job. I thought, well, people see something in me, and why not? Let me give it a try. I had tenure at that time, so I thought, well, if I don't like it, I can always go back to faculty. Yeah. And so I really took that first job in administration as an experiment to see if I could make a difference. And that really began my journey. And probably what inspired me to move on from that journey was after my first year as a dean, the president, who was giving me opportunities and was encouraging me into leadership, decided he was going to retire. And we had a going away party, and he... when I went to shake his hand and to thank him for everything that he had done for me, and he had taken me in under his wing, and had each week I met with him to just ask him questions, and he mentored me. So I was thanking him for all of that. And at that point in time, he said he would be back for my inauguration. And this was after I'd only been dean for 1 year, and to just to have someone express that kind of confidence and to give you that kind of encouragement. I never for a second thought about being a university president. That was the first time that thought was planted in my head.
Yeah, your mind was around the dean role.
I was just a new dean. I was trying to figure out what it was, what that was all about. And so to have an outgoing president who had had a very successful 2-decade career as a university president, see something in me that I hadn't seen myself, really sort of sparked that and set me off on a journey that led me to now 2 university presidencies.
Well, that's pretty cool. And that's an important lesson to remember as we go along in these journeys and other folks are looking up to us, is to remember when you think the good thoughts, to share them. You know, it makes such a difference in others' lives.
Every step of my life, Susan, that's been, when I think about, actually when I left Truman, they had a series there called The Last Lecture, and you maybe have heard this. Other universities do this as well, and that is they'll ask someone to give a lecture, and but it's as if it's your last lecture you can give. So what would be your last lecture? That's a pretty profound question.
It is.
To try and answer. And so what do you talk about? And it was a wonderful opportunity, and they did it in a large auditorium for me because I was leaving the university. And so I had a large crowd, and I knew that this was an opportunity for me as I was leaving that community to sort of impart on them what I had learned on my journey. And the theme of my talk was invest in people, because everything that has happened in my life for the good that has helped me in my development as a leader has been because someone else has invested in me. And I can sort of point to different occasions throughout my life where someone saw something in me and took the time and invested in my life that made a transformative difference.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful. And you know, Troy, that's who you want in a leadership role, especially one so special as the one you're in. You know, you have the opportunity to really make a difference being the president of a university. I mean, that's an awesome responsibility.
Well, yeah, if I ponder it too much, maybe it's too big of a responsibility for me. But yeah, I mean, you know, in some ways it is. And being a university president is challenging, I think, because of the variety of constituents you have to lead and you have to bring together, and especially at a time that we're living through where it's hard to bring people together on anything.
Goodness.
It's particularly challenging. But, I think that I kind of take it off in small bites, and I just think about kind of what are those values, what are those principles, what are the things that guide me in each of my relationships and each of my interactions. And usually all the other stuff kind of takes care of itself. If you do those fundamentals right, if you treat people the right way, if you respect them, generally a lot of the big decisions and the responsibilities that come with the job, they're big decisions that have to be made, but I never make them by myself. That they are made collectively with others on my leadership team and others in the community. And if you can bring people together and benefit from their ideas and perspectives in making those decisions, usually they become pretty obvious by the time you make them.
Mm-hmm. Now, that's kind of a leadership style, because some people are very decisive, like on their own, and don't always bring in those others. I certainly relate to that. I tend to do that as well. Does it ever get in the way? Do you ever feel like it slows you down, or is it just right on time for you on bringing people together on that?
No, I mean, I'm an impatient sort, and like a lot of people who come into these positions, you want to move your institution, your organization forward, and you want forward momentum. And when you see opportunities, you want to seize them. You want to take advantage of them. When you see challenges or problems, you want to solve them.
Yeah.
You don't want to take a long time. You don't want to dither for sure. So no, I'm oftentimes impatient. I'm also oftentimes very frustrated. And I'm frustrated with sometimes the collaborative process. Even though I know it ultimately will bring a better result, sometimes it is frustrating. But what I've learned is that every decision I make is better when I first take the time to listen and bring diverse perspectives to the table. And so I know just from experience that the decision will be better in the long run if I take the time to bring other people in and listen to their ideas first.
Right. Well, I'm with you on that. I totally agree. It sure was hard when we think back over the last 2 years, particularly at the beginning, when we had to make so many decisions so quickly. I think having those people, though, around you that can help support that probably makes some of the hard decisions. I mean, when you started, like when you think back to being at Truman, you would have never thought there'd be a day where you had to do things like shutting down classes and wearing masks and all the different rules. I mean,
there was no preparation for this, as you know, Susan, and I'm sure you experienced in your life and in your talk with other leaders. There's nothing that's prepared us for this. But again, I think when you are thrown into a crisis situation where decisions have to be made fast, sometimes I call them battlefield decisions, right?
Sure,
You're in the middle of battle and you have to make quick decisions. Even if you get it wrong, I think that those you are leading will give you the benefit of the doubt if you've done the work beforehand to build the trust in the community, and people know that the decisions you're making, you're making them in what you believe to be the best interest of the whole. And if you can frame your decisions around what is guiding you, those principles, again, it's why it's so critically important in the outset of any decision-making process to be able to articulate very clearly, these are what the principles are that are guiding me. And in this case, it was pretty easy, especially in the early days. It's public health. We have individual and public health. We got to be conscious of the health and safety of our community, both at Mary Washington, but in the broader Fredericksburg community. And so what is our responsibility? And so that guided our decision making. Now, as we went through the pandemic, it became more complicated as there became other interests. How do we, because maybe the second principle is we want to do everything we could to continue to offer a high quality education to our students to allow them to graduate on time. And so some of these became competing interests, and you had to balance this, and that has continued to be the case over the last 2 years, whereas there becomes more and more interest, then you start worrying about the mental health of your community and some of the stress that all the protocols we've put in place has caused on our students and our faculty and staff. So you have to start balancing all of this, and it gets complicated.
Yes.
And everyone is, and you can relate to this. At a time like this, and with a polarized country that we've been experiencing, think about it, the last 2 years hasn't only witnessed a pandemic, a public health crisis. Sure. Of course, we've We faced social unrest. We faced political unrest.
Certainly.
And we've had to manage through a public health crisis while we're also dealing with these other things that seem to be dividing us more than bringing us together. And then you're making critical decisions. And I can tell you some of the decisions I've made, I've been, on both sides. I remember when I was making the first decision whether or not we are going to bring students back in the fall of 2020 after we had sent them home in the spring. And, it's a long time ago now, but you might recall that wasn't an easy decision to make. So I was, some schools were keeping their students at home for a while. We were going to online. Do we bring students back? Don't we bring them back? There are economic imperatives. Our business model at a public liberal arts university like Mary Washington is that, we generate revenue to support our operations through students living on campus.
Sure.
Okay, is bringing students back on campus, is that a health risk? If we don't bring them back, what do? Do we start laying people off? So these are the kinds of decisions.
Circle.
And then in the process, you are being told, whether it's via social media or via email, either by bringing students back. I had one email that said I would have blood on my hands because people were going to die if I brought students back. It's if you could remember, put yourself back in this place. We didn't know, and then later on, when you start applying some of the protocols, I was being accused of violating the Nuremberg codes, and so you're balancing all of this and trying with all that noise make the right decisions. And I would never pretend to say that I got it right 100% of the time. But again, I think we got it right most of the time by, again, following our principles and listening to people. One of the things that we did is we brought in health experts. We brought in not only virologists on campus, but we were so fortunate that Mary Washington Hospital would do anything it could to help and collaborate with us.
Yes.
And I remember, that Dr. McDermott said, he's a friend of mine. I was able to call him and ask him questions, and then he made available to us as an advisor the chief medical officer, Dr. Newman.
That's incredible.
And just having that kind of collaboration, that kind of relationship. Again, this is formed over years of trust and community building. And so just having that to help guide the decision making, as I said earlier, made the decisions a lot clearer. And I wouldn't say easy, but at least a lot clearer.
Right, leaning on those people, it's just so important. It's interesting, you've kind of touched on a topic that's really big for the Chamber this year, again, which is civility. When you hadn't been here long, in 2017, you'd been here a year and a half or so, we did our first forums on civility at the time, and you helped us with some videos and some things we did on that topic. I think it's such an important topic, and so just this week, as I'm sitting down with you later this week, we are hosting another event about civility. Feels like the conversation's gotten more difficult, and that pains me to say that. I was with a class a week or so ago, and we talked about it, and I could tell there was a space in the room where it was uncomfortable for people to even talk about civility and uncivility. What are your thoughts about that today?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you and the Chamber for leading that conversation in our community. It's so critically important. Yeah. Difficult, yes, but so critically important. So thank you for taking that on. It's at the core of what we do as a public university. We feel that we are a place that should be, first and foremost, we're about a lot of things, but first and foremost, we should be preparing good citizens for our democracy who are going to go back into their communities and work with others to make their communities better. At our core, that's what we do. Yes, we want to prepare them to make a living and all those sorts of things as well, but that is our most important job, is to make sure that they're good citizens. And the only way you can do that is expose them to differences and to those who have different perspectives and come from different backgrounds, have different views of the world, and be able to talk about fundamentally important issues, sometimes really difficult issues where people have strong opinions, but be able to talk about them in a way that shows respect and civility. It's the only way we're going to come together as a democracy. It's the only way we're going to come together as a community, is to have that foundation, again, of respect and civility and trust with one another, and to be able to deal with those who you don't agree with. I know I take a lot of time, more and more as I get older and older, to intentionally, whether it's through reading or listening to podcasts or what have you, to expose myself to those who disagree with me on issues. So I can have a better understanding of where they're coming from. And sometimes I'm persuaded, actually.
Surprising, isn't it? You finally learned, like, that the New England Patriots were the best team.
Well,
You know I had to go there at some point.
Well, they were until Tom Brady left.
I know.
will say that.
Fair enough.
Yeah, well, as someone from Indianapolis who's a Colts fan, this is a real sore subject for me. The number of times I had to watch Tom Brady and the New England Patriots march down the field on my Colts for a winning touchdown. Painful. But yes, this is a difficult time we're living through.
Yes.
But I think it's important for all of us in our communities, but particularly leaders, is to be able to lead through this time with great hope and optimism. One of the things that I think is most discouraging to me is sometimes when I hear leaders express skepticism about our future at a time like this. And I realize we have to be realists and face that, and recognize the significant challenges we're facing as a country and in our communities. But I think we have to also believe in our future and invest in our future and believe that, yes, just like other times in our history, we've gone through incredibly difficult times, but in the end, we've been able to make, I think, our country better by ultimately working together on some of those, identifying what the problems are and then working together to solve them. And I'm still working with young people, 18 to 22. That's what gives me the greatest hope.
Oh, it has
inspires
to.
me. Is
yes.
I work with these young people. Kelly and I have them over into our house at Brompton. We talk to them. And after an hour of talking to some of these young people who are so inspiring, are so hopeful, and want to invest in their communities and serve, it's hard not to be hopeful and optimistic, even at a time like this.
Of course. Oh, well, that's just so great to hear. I love it. And back to the beginning when I mentioned The Social History of the United States, 1960s, this book. So I'm going back there because you don't know this. When I went to VCU in Richmond, Virginia, in the 80s, and the history I learned growing up here kind of ended in high school around like World War II. So back in the 80s, there wasn't an internet, et cetera. So I was really curious about things like, the 60s especially. I was very interested. The music I liked was from that period of time. I was born in the 60s. In fact, the day I was born, the Rolling Stones were number one, but I digress. and so I think we might have a common ground there. But there, think about that volatile period of time. So interesting. And look at today, it's like 50 years later, not that I am, but you're seeing some repeats in it seemed like our youth seemed so separated then, and so much of the music was reflective of that, and there was so much division, and look, that's now the establishment, so everything kind of is cyclical, and you have to believe in that and really talk to people to have that understanding, Yeah,
as someone who, I guess I'm still a historian, even though I don't practice it. Kind of like I'm a lawyer, but I don't practice it. One of the things you do as a historian is you look at both continuity and change. What are some things that sort of remain, and what are the forces that continue to change our society? And I think you can look at the 60s as something that, it was a very volatile, divisive time, with the country dealing with some very difficult issues, from Vietnam to the Civil Rights Movement, war on poverty, and go on and on. Assassinations, think of all the assassinations that occurred in the 1960s. Yes. And then you can fast forward to our time, and in some ways even more complicated in the age of an internet and social media and all the globalization that has occurred since that time that has sort of pulled us apart. But I think we can also recognize that this is a country that can work through a time like that, and then on the other side, continue to improve as a society and as a democracy. So it looks dark right now, but I often believe it's darkest before the dawn, and I'm still hopeful.
Good. Me too. I'll just do one other aside from them before we wrap up. I just thought of it while you were talking. While I was in that course, Dr. Farmer was teaching at the university, and Marguerite Young arranged for me to interview him.
Oh, wow.
And so for this paper I had to do for this history course. And so I interviewed him multiple times, if you can believe it, and then ended up becoming fast friends with him, myself and my roommate Mariah. And we spent a lot of time with him, so much so that a few years later, even when I got married, he came to my wedding and stuff. Wow. But he profoundly impacted my life to be right there in the middle of the 80s. And I was a music major and rock and roll and all that. But to be able to sit down with him repeatedly.
I couldn't believe it when I came to Mary Washington. I guess I hadn't realized that he ended his career on the faculty at Mary Washington because you mentioned I wrote the book on the 1960s, so I certainly knew of James Farmer and had written about his work both at CORE and organizing the Freedom Rides.
Yes.
And so to know that he was a part of this institution's legacy, I was like, okay, this is cool.
Yeah, super amazing. So we have that common bond too. And anybody that's listening, look up the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Check out some photos and things of the campus. And right there in the dead center of the campus is a bust of Dr. Farmer. And look him up too if you don't know about Dr. James Farmer. It's a great history, and it's right here as part of our local history in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Well, already we're at overtime here a little bit, so we're going to wind it right on down. I've so enjoyed. I know it. I've so enjoyed talking with you. It's just a pleasure to sit down with you. As we wrap it up, do you have a favorite motto or saying you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, it's become a motto of mine over the last 2 years during the pandemic, and I actually got it from a Ted Lasso episode, which actually is a quote of Walt Whitman.
Yes.
Be curious, not judgmental. I've used that a lot. You talked about your own curiosity, and it kind of goes back to sort of the core of what brought me into education. But I think it also speaks to this time, is that we are too quick to make judgments of other people, sometimes based on superficial things. And to take the time before you judge, to first of all be curious and get to know someone and ask questions and listen. I think is something that has been guiding me through this time.
Oh, I love that. Be curious, not judgmental. That's terrific. Thank you for that, Troy. Anything else you'd like to share with our listeners?
No, I just for those of you who are in leadership roles or aspire to leadership roles, just be your authentic self and really understand what guides you, what are those principles, what are those values, and then be very transparent about that. When people know who you are and know what you stand for, it really builds a level of trust, and that is, as I said earlier, the foundation to, I think, effective leadership.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that. And that word trust and values, you repeated them throughout our conversation, so it really resonates. Thank you. And again, I'm delighted to be here with you today and look forward to seeing you again very soon.
Well, thank you, Susan, for the opportunity.
Absolutely. And thanks to our listeners for spending time with us today. I am Susan Spears, and our guest today was Dr. Troy Paino, President of the University of Mary Washington. If you have not already subscribed to the Chambers We Are Business podcast, go ahead and do so. Now you'll know when new episodes are available. And while you're at it, if you could jump on over and give us a review so other listeners can find us easily, we would be so very appreciative. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.